Story 1. Cato the Censor's War on Luxury. You're sitting quietly in a modest Roman atrium. The walls are bare. The couch has no cushions. The wine is diluted. There is no music. There are no garlands. This is not a punishment, it's a lifestyle. Welcome to the world of Marcus Porcius Cato, more famously remembered as Cato the Elder or Cato the Censor. A man whose legacy was built on one singular idea: luxury is decay. Cato was born in 234 BCE in a small town called Tusculum just southeast of Rome. His family wasn't elite. They were novi homines, new men outsiders to the tightly knit aristocracy of Rome. But what they lacked in pedigree, they made up for in tenacity. Cato was raised in the rustic tradition, doing farm work, eating simple meals, and reading what little Latin literature existed at the time. His worldview: Rome was falling prey to foreign corruption, especially that of the Greeks. Philosophy: a dangerous foreign import. Flute players at dinner: an abomination. Silk clothing: the beginning of the end. He believed in mos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors. And in his view, the ancestors didn't wear purple robes or attend banquets with peacock meat. But this wasn't just a personal ethic. Cato was determined to make it the law. By the time he entered politics, Rome was becoming something new. The Punic Wars had flooded the city with slaves, spoils, and Greek ideas. Former farmers were becoming city dwellers. Public life was more theatrical. Cato hated it all. And so he climbed the ladder of Roman public office not for ambition, but as a kind of moral crusade. He started as a quaestor, a financial officer, moved on to aedile overseer of markets and games, then praetor, and finally consul in 195 BCE. With each step, he gained a reputation as a scold, a disciplinarian, and somehow an electable one. His speeches railed against extravagance. He prosecuted fellow senators for corruption. He even supervised the construction of aqueducts, insisting they be built cheaply and without ornament. But it was his final role, censor, that would define him. The Roman censor was responsible for two things: conducting the census, essentially keeping track of Roman citizens, and upholding public morality. It was a position that came around only once every 5 years and lasted just 18 months. But the censor had unmatched soft power. He could strike senators from the rolls. He could shame wealthy citizens. And he could shape the moral compass of the republic. Cato became censor in 184 BCE, and from the moment he took office, it was clear he had plans. He attacked luxury like it was Hannibal himself. He imposed taxes on expensive clothing and jewelry. He fined citizens for having too many slaves or too large a household staff. He removed men from the Senate for reasons as small as public drunkenness or conspicuous consumption. He forced bakers to reduce the size of bread loaves. No detail was too small. He even went after the construction of new buildings. Houses with columns, unnecessary; wall paintings, immoral. He believed marble softened men's minds. For Cato, Rome should remain a city of stone, sweat, and sacrifice. But here's the uncomfortable truth: Rome didn't listen. Even as Cato scolded and fined, the city continued to change. Luxury became normalized. Imports increased. The average Roman was more interested in comfort than Cato's moral purity. And yet, Cato didn't stop. He just became louder, more irritable, more determined to stamp out sin. He began writing, a rarity for a Roman statesman of his generation. His works included Origins, a now-lost history of Rome, and De Agricultura, a manual on farming that doubles as a rant against decadence. In it, he lists what a proper Roman farmer should do, what he should eat, what he should wear, and how many slaves he should own. It is detailed. It is repetitive. It is, in many ways, boring, but that was the point. Virtue to Cato was found in repetition, in simplicity, in boredom. And still, the city glittered around him. There's a certain irony in this. The more Cato tried to force Rome backward, the faster it moved forward. Wealthy Romans began to find his antics amusing. His speeches, once firebrands, became parodies of themselves. People began to take pride in having been censured by Cato. It was almost a status symbol. To be called out by Cato meant you were wealthy enough to matter. In his later years, Cato turned to the Senate with a new obsession. Carthage must be destroyed. Even when discussing unrelated topics, he would end his speeches with Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. It was dramatic, redundant, effective, and it became a joke among the younger senators. Was this the same with his war on luxury? Had Cato become Rome's longest-running joke? Possibly, but jokes have power. Even as he was mocked, Cato shaped the conversation. Senators still referenced mos maiorum. Debates on morality never left the forum, and even those who rejected his views had to respond to them. By the time of his death in 149 BCE, Cato had become a symbol, a curmudgeon, a moralist, a reminder of an older Rome. The Senate no longer feared him, but they remembered him. And in politics, being remembered is its own form of victory. But here's the deeper question. Was Cato right? Was Rome's decline into empire accelerated by its embrace of luxury? Was his rigid stoicism a lost virtue or simply misplaced nostalgia? Or more curiously, was Cato playing a longer game than anyone realized? When we left Cato, he was a grumbling moralist wandering through a city that no longer wanted to hear his sermons. But the story didn't end with his censorate or even with his death. In fact, in many ways, it only began there. Because something strange happened in the years following 149 BCE. Cato became more powerful dead than alive. The afterlife of a Stoic. After his death, Cato's ideas, those rants and repetitive laments about virtue, luxury, and corruption were remembered. His writings were preserved. His sayings were repeated. And although he had railed against Greek learning, he became, ironically, the subject of philosophical admiration by later generations. Part of this was due to timing. Rome was entering a new phase, one marked by territorial expansion, massive slave economies, and anxieties about Roman identity. When an empire grows, so do its contradictions. Wealth brings comfort, but also fear of softness. Victories bring pride, but also confusion about what's being defended. And so, senators began to quote Cato not because they wanted to follow his rules, but because they wanted to appear like they cared about the rules. They adopted his language. They referenced his standards. They invoked mos maiorum in speeches that were later followed by visits to lavish parties. This, perhaps, was Cato's true victory. You see, Cato understood something about power that few of his contemporaries did: the politics of memory. While most Roman senators sought glory through conquest or grand monuments, Cato embedded himself in the daily rhythms of Roman life: laws, morality, customs, and above all, the written word. He wrote things down. He documented his vision of the ideal Roman, not in stone, but in papyrus, in boring, repetitive, prescriptive papyrus. And Rome couldn't look away. The laws that nobody followed. One of Cato's most lasting effects was in the development of sumptuary laws, those strange Roman legal codes that attempted to regulate personal spending, appearance, and even taste. Though he didn't invent them, he certainly promoted them. During and after his censorship, Roman politicians passed multiple laws limiting the number of guests at dinner parties, the amount of silver one could own, the type of clothing permitted at public events, the maximum spending allowed at weddings and funerals, the display of jewelry on women, always a favorite topic for Roman male lawmakers. The laws were detailed, they were argued, they were passed with great ceremony, and they were almost entirely unenforceable. Enforcement often required elite citizens to spy on one another, and no Roman patrician wanted to be seen as a tattletale. The laws would be passed and then quietly ignored until some new crisis prompted a senator to say, "Remember Cato, he warned us about this." The greatest irony: these laws created a kind of luxury arms race. The more restrictions that were passed, the more creative elites became at evading them. They'd hold private parties disguised as religious events. They'd host rotating dinners with multiple courses served in separate houses to avoid guest limits. They'd bury jewelry before tax inspections. What Cato had done was ignite a new cultural performance. Luxury wrapped in modesty. Excess disguised as tradition. Even the plain tunics of conservative senators were sometimes dyed in subtly expensive tints barely legal, but deeply symbolic. Cato's descendants and the idea of legacy. Nowhere is the strange influence of Cato clearer than in his descendants, most famously Marcus Porcius Cato Uticensis, known to history as Cato the Younger. A great-grandson of Cato the Elder, Cato the Younger was raised almost as a mythological figure in his family. His tutors read him his ancestors' writings like scripture. And so he became a living throwback, a man entirely out of sync with his own time. Born in 95 BCE, Cato the Younger was raised during a period of unprecedented corruption, violence, and civil war in the Republic. He reacted to the chaos by becoming a hyper-Cato, more stoic, more rigid, more relentlessly moral than even his great-grandfather. He walked barefoot in winter. He slept on the ground. He memorized laws. He refused bribes. He gave speeches in plain clothes even when running against opponents dressed in gold-threaded togas. Cato the Younger had only one idol, the elder Cato. But here, where things become even more surreal. Cato the Younger tried to use this inherited moralism to stop Julius Caesar. He opposed Caesar at every turn. He gave long, slow speeches about legality and tradition. He believed that by citing laws and upholding the Constitution, or what was left of it, he could prevent a dictatorship. And Caesar laughed him off. Because while Cato believed in the idea of Rome as it had once been, Caesar understood what Rome had become. An empire of spectacle, of military command, of personality over principle. Caesar represented reality. Cato was performance. The final act came when Cato, facing defeat and refusing to live under Caesar's rule, committed suicide in 46 BCE. He stabbed himself in the stomach, and when the wound wasn't fatal, he ripped it open with his own hands. It was meant as the ultimate act of stoic defiance, one last tribute to the values of the old republic. Caesar responded with silence. Later, he sarcastically remarked that Cato's suicide was more of a public gesture than a private conviction. Still, it worked. Cato the Younger became a martyr, and the elder Cato's legacy was revived again. Philosophers began writing about both Catos as if they were prophets. Conservative senators kept their portraits. Even Emperor Augustus Caesar's heir pretended to value their ideals, building temples and passing new, mostly symbolic, morality laws in their name. It was the ultimate twist. Cato the censor's war on luxury outlived him not because it succeeded, but because it failed so loudly. Cato in the forum of public memory. By the time the Roman Empire reached its peak in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Cato had become almost folkloric. He was cited by Tacitus. He was referenced by Plutarch. He was studied by Stoics, and he was invoked by anyone who wanted to appear serious. In the Senate, quoting Cato was a political move. In the Forum, referencing his reforms was a sign of virtue. In the home, reading his agricultural manual was a quiet act of nostalgia for a lost world. And yet no one wanted to live like Cato, not really. Roman villas were lavish, banquets grew ever more elaborate, aqueducts flowed to private fountains, slaves became status symbols, marble was everywhere. But the name Cato lingered like a ghost, like a warning. A name senators would whisper when someone spent too much. A phrase scrawled on political graffiti, what would Cato say? It was never clear whether the question was sincere or sarcastic. Did Cato win by losing? Here's the historical paradox at the heart of this story. Can a man who failed in every immediate goal still shape the culture around him? Cato lost. The Rome he wanted, a modest, rustic, honest republic, vanished within a generation. His laws were mocked, his rules broken, his values tossed aside like so many discarded togas. But centuries later, he was still there, not in power but in memory. And memory, in Rome, was everything. Romans didn't just build monuments, they built narratives. They created myths out of the mundane. They turned boring moralists into tragic heroes. And perhaps that was Cato's unspoken strategy all along, not to win the moment but to haunt the ages, to become the measuring stick of virtue, even if no one could measure up. Still, we're left with a lingering puzzle. Did Cato understand his own role in the performance of politics? Was he truly naive in believing he could reform Rome? Or did he know that by failing, he would ensure his name would never be forgotten? If you walk the Forum Romanum today, or what's left of it, you will find a city littered with contradictions. Temples to discipline, next to markets of excess. Shrines to ancestral virtue, beside evidence of opulence that no farmer would ever recognize. Rome is a monument to its own hypocrisies. And somewhere among the ghost stones of this political theater, Cato still lingers. He is not the statue with a sword or the face on a coin. He is the voice in the corner of the Senate chamber, grumbling about Greek influence, while senators prepare for another foreign campaign. He is the footnote in every debate about mos maiorum. He is the joke everyone keeps repeating, long after they've forgotten the punchline. This is the story of how Cato became a permanent fixture of Rome's political culture, not through power, but through persistence. The eternal scold. Centuries after his death, Cato became something of a cautionary archetype. To be called a Cato was to be labeled rigid, severe, or out of touch. The name itself had become shorthand for the kind of person who cared more about principle than popularity, more about precedent than practicality. The historian Tacitus, writing in the late 1st century CE, paints a bleak portrait of imperial politics, but even he nods to the old republican values Cato had once championed. Tacitus' admiration, though tinged with pessimism, keeps Cato alive as an ideal, even in an age when ideals had long since been traded for imperial pageantry. Even Juvenal, the satirical poet, couldn't resist referencing Cato sarcastically, of course. In one poem, he wonders what Cato would say if he saw Rome's elite being pulled through the streets by imported slaves, on their way to another banquet. By this time, Cato had become two people. The historical man, buried in 149 BCE. The eternal ghost, revived every time Rome questioned its soul. And every generation did question it. Moral performance as political ritual. It's important to understand that Roman politics was never about simple governance. It was theater, public speaking, oratory, costumes, symbolic rituals and gestures mattered just as much, sometimes more, than the policies themselves. Cato understood this. His censorate was not just an office, it was a performance of moral authority. Every fine he issued, every senator he expelled, every anti-luxury law he supported was meant to send a message. But the message was so repetitive, so humorless, so deliberate that it began to take on the rhythm of ritual. Rituals are comforting. They repeat, even when people stop believing in their power. That's what Cato became, the ritual invocation of discipline, the annual moral panic, the Senate's version of saying grace before a gluttonous feast. His name was invoked before budget debates. His writings were cited in arguments over taxes on silk or perfumes. His values were discussed at length during court trials right before judgments were swayed by bribes. No one actually lived like Cato, but everyone agreed he had been right in theory. And so the joke continued, not because it was funny, but because it was necessary. The unintentional legacy, inspiration through failure. What makes Cato's story particularly Roman is that he failed and Rome loved him for it. Romans admired virtue, and gravitas, seriousness, but they especially admired those who stuck to their values to the bitter end, even when no one else did. This gave rise to a strange tradition, political martyrdom by moralism. Future Roman figures, senators, generals, philosophers modeled themselves on Cato, not because they thought they could win, but because they believed that standing firm in defeat was the ultimate form of dignity. It was a concept the historian Plutarch deeply admired. In his parallel lives, Plutarch pairs Cato with Agricola, another figure of Stoic endurance. Cato is presented not as a successful statesman, but as an eternal moral landmark, a man who refused to adjust to his times, and therefore stood as proof that values, even rigid ones, could survive the erosion of empires. In this light, Cato's life wasn't a joke at all. It was a quiet rebellion, a refusal to evolve, and in Rome that made him heroic. Cato and the empire, a symbol reused. Let's fast forward again. By the 2nd century CE, Rome was at its territorial peak. The empire stretched from Scotland to Syria, from Spain to the Persian Gulf. Roads were paved, aqueducts flowed, and administrators filed reports in triplicate. The Senate still existed, but now it was mostly ceremonial, rubber-stamping imperial decisions. And yet, senators still gave speeches quoting Cato the censor. The emperors, too, played along. Augustus passed sweeping moral reforms in 18 BCE, claiming he was restoring the old values. He cited Cato. He even punished citizens for adultery and banned excessive spending at parties. Of course, Augustus himself lived in a palace and ran the empire like a god. Later emperors Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and even Marcus Aurelius each made nods to Cato's ideals, sometimes in law, sometimes in literature, often in hollow symbolism. Statues were erected. Cato's name was carved into forums and academies. Philosophers wrote treatises inspired by his life. But Cato remained a shadow, always there, never quite present. His influence had become cultural muscle memory, a twitch of moral guilt every time Rome stared into the mirror. A caution for modern times. It may be tempting to dismiss Cato as a relic, an old man yelling at clouds, whose rants were outdated before the ink had dried on his edicts. But there's something eerily modern about him, too. Consider today's endless debates over cultural decline, excessive consumption, moral decay, tradition versus change, public virtue versus private vice. These are not modern debates. They are Cato's debates played out again and again. He has become the template for the last good man, the one standing against a tide that cannot be stopped. Whether admired or mocked, his voice remains. In politics, you don't always need to win to influence. Sometimes it's enough to refuse to be silent, to show up, deliver your speech, file your objections, and watch the world spin past you. Even if people roll their eyes, they remember you. The longest-running joke in Roman politics. So let's ask again. Was Cato the censor a joke? Yes, sometimes. He was parodied. He was quoted sarcastically. He was turned into a symbol of tedious virtue and unyielding moralism. But the real joke, the longest-running one in Roman politics, was this. They kept quoting him, long after ignoring his policies, long after revering his reforms, long after mocking his legacy. Rome kept bringing Cato back because Rome needed him not as a leader but as a mirror, a slow, stubborn, judgmental mirror. Every empire tells itself a story. Rome's story was one of conquest, progress, and grandeur. But behind that curtain, tucked into the moral closet, was Cato, the quiet reminder that they had once meant well. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Reflection. Cato's story reminds us that influence isn't always obvious. It doesn't always arrive with banners and applause. Sometimes it comes in the form of repetition, of boring speeches, of laws that no one wants to follow but no one quite dares to erase. And so we end where we began, with a man sitting in a modest Roman atrium. No garlands, no silk, no applause. Just a scroll in hand, muttering about mos maiorum, while the world continues without him. Story 2. The Grain Dole, a bureaucratic nightmare that fed an empire. Close your eyes and imagine a crowded Roman street. It's loud, chaotic, and smells like a mixture of olive oil, sweat, dust, and freshly baked bread. The people are restless, not because a war has broken out, not because an emperor has died, but because there is a delay at the grain distribution office. For the average Roman citizen, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a crisis. This is the story of the grain dole, one of the most boring, bureaucratic, and strangely vital systems in Roman history. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't make for good theater. But for nearly 500 years, it held the Roman world together. And behind it, all was a never-ending parade of clerks, scribes, and stoic administrators buried in grain ledgers, struggling to feed an empire that had promised its citizens something deceptively simple: free bread. Why grain? Grain in the Roman world was more than just food. It was currency, stability, and control all rolled into one. Bread was the cornerstone of the Roman diet, cheap, filling, and relatively easy to transport. A government that provided grain kept the peace. A government that failed to do so invited riots, revolts, and political collapse. By the late Republic, Rome had grown too large to feed itself. The city imported grain from Sicily, North Africa, and later Egypt. These shipments, called annona, were managed, taxed, and distributed through an elaborate system of ports, granaries, and bureaucratic checkpoints. The problem: none of it was simple. Moving millions of bushels of grain across the Mediterranean every year, in an age before engines or railroads, required a logistical miracle. And the miracle had to happen on time. The birth of the dole. The Roman grain dole, or cura annoni, didn't begin as an act of generosity. It began as a political bribe. In 123 BCE, the reformer Gaius Gracchus proposed that the Roman state should sell grain at a subsidized rate to Roman citizens. It was, in theory, a safety net, a way to keep poor Romans from starving while still maintaining the dignity of payment. But over the decades, this system evolved. By the time of Clodius Pulcher in 58 BCE, the grain dole was free. Clodius, a populist politician with an eye for power, eliminated the grain tax altogether. He created a permanent list of recipients and established state-funded distribution points. Suddenly, tens of thousands of Roman citizens no longer needed to pay for their daily bread. It was revolutionary and also a nightmare. Rome's hunger for paperwork. To administer the grain dole, the Roman state developed a deeply unglamorous infrastructure. Registries of eligible citizens, verified by censors. Grain warehouses, horia, strategically placed around the city. Distributors, public slaves or contractors who weighed and handed out the monthly rations. Receipts and tallies, stamped in clay or ink, stored in dusty archives. Ships marked with imperial seals, loaded at Alexandria or Carthage under close supervision. Every part of the system was vulnerable. A delay in shipping, shortage. A corrupt official, falsified weights. A warehouse fire, total disaster. Worse still, citizens could lose their grain eligibility for failing to appear for verification or missing a distribution. Some bribed officials to remain on the rolls. Others sold their ration tokens on the black market. At its peak under Augustus, more than 320,000 citizens were receiving free grain every month. Imagine the size of the spreadsheet. Political theater, and the promise of bread. The grain dole wasn't just a food policy, it was a symbol of legitimacy. Every political faction in late Republican Rome had a grain policy. Reformers promised to expand it. Conservatives warned it would ruin Roman virtue. And emperors, once in power, used the dole as a tool of control. Augustus, for example, slashed the number of eligible citizens, publicly claiming he was reducing fraud, though privately it was about cost. Later emperors expanded the dole again during crises. In times of famine, they imported more grain, even at enormous expense. Bread became propaganda. It was cheap to promise, expensive to deliver, but deadly to interrupt. The famous phrase, panem et circenses, bread and circuses, wasn't metaphorical. Rome's leaders kept the masses calm by giving them food and distraction. Gladiator games were loud, but grain shortages were dangerous. One missed shipment could lead to street riots. One burned granary could become a political scandal. Emperors were judged not only by their armies or buildings, but by how often the bread showed up on time. Grain as empire building. To keep this machine running, Rome developed a kind of colonial infrastructure of grain. Sicily was the first breadbasket. Conquered early, it provided high-quality grain until over-farming and taxation pushed it into decline. North Africa, especially Numidia and Carthage, became the next major supplier, with expansive estates run by Roman settlers and local elites. But the ultimate source came later, Egypt. After Augustus annexed Egypt in 30 BCE, Rome gained access to the Nile Delta's fertile floodplains, where grain could be harvested in massive quantities. The grain fleet from Alexandria became the most important shipment of the year. Special imperial officials oversaw Egyptian agriculture, ensuring that Rome's needs came first even at the cost of local Egyptian food security. And every spring, as the Nile grain arrived in Ostia's port, Roman politicians breathed a sigh of relief. Rome's belly had been filled. For now, a culture of dependency. Over time, the grain dole became not just a system, but a right. Citizens expected it, debated it, used it to measure the success or failure of their rulers. Some conservatives saw this as moral decay, the transformation of proud Roman farmers into idle, urban dependents. And in truth, the grain dole did encourage urban migration. People left farms and villages in Italy, choosing to live in cramped apartments near Rome's distribution centers. This created a new class, the plebs urbana, urban citizens who had little wealth but full Roman rights and the power of the mob behind them. And that mob could make or break a politician's career. The hidden cost of free bread. The Roman grain dole was never just about food. It was about control, compliance, and the quiet price of dependency. For all its bureaucratic elegance, the system had downsides. It discouraged self-sufficiency, pulling people away from the land. It created supply bottlenecks, where Rome's survival hinged on one or two regions. It incentivized corruption, with fraudulent records and bribed officials. And most dangerously, it concentrated power. Whoever controlled the grain controlled Rome. That's why emperors took personal responsibility for it. The praefectus Annani, the official in charge of the grain supply, answered not to the Senate, but to the emperor himself. It was too important to be left to politics. But therein lies the question. Did this system hold the empire together, or quietly poison it from within? Was feeding the people with free grain a brilliant act of social engineering? Or did it turn the Roman populace into a dependent mass, always waiting for the next shipment? You're standing in a Roman horium, a grain warehouse. It's vast and windowless. The air is heavy with dust and the dry scent of wheat. Wooden barrels creak under the weight of grain. Scribes move silently, tablets in hand, checking off delivery lists. Slaves pour grain into large sacks, Overseers shout figures. The ledgers are thick, the ink smudged. Every name, every number must match. This is not a battlefield. It is not a temple. And yet, in many ways, it's where the fate of Rome was decided. Because in Rome, politics was paperwork and grain was everything. How to feed 1 million people without computers. By the early empire, the city of Rome housed somewhere between 750,000 to over 1 million people. No other city in the ancient world even came close. This massive population, many of them poor, depended almost entirely on the state for their daily bread. There were no supermarkets, no modern markets, and no food stamps. Instead, there was a rigid structure of port officials to receive incoming grain ships, granary clerks to track inventory, prefects to organize transport from port to warehouse, public slaves or contractors to portion and distribute the monthly ration, and perhaps most importantly, record keepers to manage the lists of eligible citizens. The Roman Empire did this without calculators, typewriters, or spreadsheets. Everything was carved, scratched, or inked by hand. Mistakes were frequent, corrections were tedious, but still the system worked, usually. The grain ships of the empire. A core feature of the system was the Alexandrian grain fleet. These were no ordinary ships. By the 1st century CE, some of the grain vessels sailing from Egypt to Rome were among the largest in the ancient world, some over 100 feet long, carrying up to 350 tons of grain. These ships were privately owned but state contracted. The state guaranteed protection, docking priority, and occasionally even tax exemptions for merchants who delivered grain to the capital. Emperors treated this supply line as sacred. One of the worst accusations a ruler could face was failing to maintain grain shipments. When Claudius took the throne in 41 CE, his first move was to stabilize the grain supply. And when Nero faced accusations of ignoring a famine in 64 CE, it seriously damaged his already fragile image. Rome's dependency on imported grain created a form of quiet imperialism. Provinces existed, in part, to feed the capital. Who got the grain? Eligibility and exclusion. So who was entitled to the fermentatio, the grain dole? The answer changed over time. During the late Republic, the system was somewhat democratic. Any adult male Roman citizen who registered could, in theory, receive grain. But under Augustus, things became more centralized and selective. To receive free grain, you had to be a male Roman citizen. Women, children, and slaves were excluded, though families benefited indirectly. Register in the census. This required being physically present and declared in good legal standing. Apply and receive a tessera fermentaria, a wooden or bronze token with your name and distribution station. These tokens were specific. They told you where to go and when to collect your grain, typically once a month. Arrive on the wrong day, miss your spot, too bad. To control abuse, the number of recipients was limited. Augustus capped the grain dole to around 200,000 people. Later emperors adjusted that number up or down depending on resources and political need. The list became a privileged club of sorts. Being on it meant you had access to food. Being removed could mean starvation. Small wonder that bribes were common. Distribution days, the politics of the line. On distribution days, Rome's porticos and granaries filled with crowds. Citizens would line up for hours, waiting for their measure of grain. Overseers checked tesserae, scribes marked names off clay tablets, and laborers scooped out rations, usually modii, the Roman dry measure, equivalent to about 6.5 liters per person. The scene was often tense. People argued, scales were contested, sacks were miscounted. Sometimes fights broke out. Occasionally, full-on riots erupted if rumors spread of spoiled grain or short deliveries. To maintain order, guards were posted. Some granaries even had military detachments nearby, not to protect the grain but to protect the distributors. At no point was the system calm or quiet, but for the average Roman citizen, it was as vital as oxygen. Grain beyond Rome, the dole expands. Over time, other cities adopted versions of the grain dole. Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople developed grain distributions during the later empire. Provincial elites mimicked the practice, offering euergetism public generosity in the form of food handouts or festival bread. Roman colonies in Gaul and North Africa saw hybrid systems, where local officials distributed grain during times of shortage. Yet the system always remained most elaborate in Rome itself. No other city built such a comprehensive, bureaucratized, and ritualized food distribution system. It became part of Roman urban identity. If you were a citizen, you expected the state to feed you, not because of charity but because of entitlement. This sense of entitlement, however, had consequences: political leverage and the power of the belly. Emperors knew that the grain dole could make or break them. A hungry mob was a dangerous thing, and the Roman crowd was not passive. During the reign of Severus Alexander, 222–235 CE, a shortfall in grain shipments led to violent protests. The emperor had to make a public appearance, promise increased imports, and even lower market prices to calm the people. Other emperors, like Trajan and Hadrian, expanded grain provisions or added oil distributions to appease the masses. The idea was simple: feed the people, and they will not ask too many questions. In some cases, politicians began using grain distribution days as campaign platforms. They would hand out bonus loaves, or even throw in wine or olives to curry favor. Suddenly, a bureaucratic handout became a political spectacle. The message to citizens was unmistakable: your loyalty is worth your ration. Cracks in the system. Despite its longevity, the grain dole system was never perfect, and over time, its cracks began to show. Dependency. The system discouraged local production in Italy. Farmers couldn't compete with state-subsidized grain, and many abandoned agriculture altogether. Vulnerability. A storm in the Mediterranean, a revolt in Egypt, or a pirate attack on a single grain convoy could paralyze the city's food supply. Cost. Maintaining the system consumed enormous resources, both financial and administrative. By the 3rd century CE, it strained even the imperial treasury. Urban pressure. Rome grew faster than the state could expand its supply chains. Eventually, the population outpaced the grain capacity. And yet no one dared shut it down. The risks were too high, the crowds too volatile, the reputation cost too great. Was it worth it? The grain dole achieved something remarkable. It kept a million-person metropolis alive and stable, without refrigeration, automation, or modern supply chains. But it also transformed the relationship between citizen and state. No longer just subjects of law or military service, Roman citizens became consumers of imperial care. It was a powerful shift, and one with long-lasting implications. You didn't just obey the empire, you expected it to feed you. And the empire, in turn, expected your silence. So we must ask, did the grain dole create a stronger Rome or a softer one? Was it a bold experiment in social stability, or the beginning of an unsustainable entitlement state? Could Rome have survived without it? Or did the grain dole buy it another 2 centuries of peace? The year is 408 CE. The grain ships from Africa are late. Again, inside the city of Rome, food prices soar. The storerooms echo with emptiness. The dole queues thin, not because grain has been delivered, but because the people are losing hope. The once reliable rhythm of Rome's stomach, the monthly grain ration, is beginning to fail. It's not a dramatic ending, no final decree, no public ceremony. Just silence, delay, and hunger. This is how the grain dole quietly collapsed. Not with fanfare, but with logistical fatigue. From system to skeleton. By the late 4th century CE, the grain dole had become a ghost of its former self. The institution still existed, the warehouses, the prefects, the ship routes, but the efficiency had vanished. Why? Because the Roman state itself was unraveling. North Africa, one of Rome's key grain suppliers, became increasingly unstable due to raids, political corruption, and weakening imperial control. The tax system, already complex, began to break down. Farmers were either fleeing their lands or bribing officials to avoid taxes in kind, many of which came in the form of grain quotas. Piracy returned to the Mediterranean. The once patrolled sea lanes fell into neglect. And most critically, Rome was no longer the capital of the empire. Since the late 3rd century, emperors had increasingly ruled from Milan, Ravenna, or Constantinople. Rome was still symbolically powerful, but administratively it was an aging city, a place of monuments, not strategy. And without administrative priority, the grain stopped flowing. The sack of Rome, 410 CE, the dole disappears. 2 years after the shipment slowed to a crawl, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric I. It was the first time in over 800 years that the city had been breached by a foreign enemy. And while the sack was not as destructive as later retellings made it seem, it shattered the illusion that Rome was still the center of power. What does this have to do with the grain dole? Everything. Because Alaric's siege strategy was simple: cut off the food supply, block the roads, stop the grain carts, control the ports. Rome starved long before it fell. The siege exposed what centuries of senators had feared, but never admitted. The city was completely dependent on external food. No local agriculture, no fallback, no resilience. After 410 CE, the grain dole limped along in some form for a few more years, but it was no longer a system. It was a series of emergency handouts, a response to crisis, not a ritual of state. And then it stopped altogether. Constantinople, the last dole. But the idea didn't die in Rome. In the east, Constantinople, the new capital of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, adopted a version of the grain dole to feed its growing population. It inherited Rome's bureaucracy, its administrators, and yes, its grain obsession. Emperor Justinian IR 527-565 expanded grain distribution in the city, pairing it with oil and wine in times of famine. But even here, the dole began to weaken by the 7th century, as wars, plagues, and economic decline eroded Byzantine strength. By the time of the Arab conquests of Egypt in the 640s, the main source of grain was lost. The dole ended entirely in Constantinople soon after. It was the true death of a Roman invention that had lasted nearly 700 years. What was left behind? Though the grain itself was gone, its cultural and political legacy endured. The idea that a government could and should feed its citizens remained influential for centuries. Medieval towns adopted grain storage practices to prepare for bad harvests. Monasteries distributed bread as part of religious charity. Renaissance city-states like Florence and Venice operated food granaries and public kitchens during times of scarcity. And later, modern welfare states would debate policies that echoed Roman grain distribution: free school lunches, food stamps, public housing. In fact, the very concept of state-administered food security begins, arguably, with the grain dole. Not as charity, but as a contract between state and citizen. Dull, necessary, revolutionary. We often think of Roman innovation in terms of arches, armies, or aqueducts. But the grain dole may have been one of Rome's most radical ideas. Consider this. a government that taxed foreign provinces to feed its poorest citizens, a system of bureaucracy that kept food flowing month after month, year after year, across an empire, an administrative commitment to the daily needs of its people not for generosity, but for stability. And it worked. For centuries, Rome did not fall because of hunger. It fell because it stopped caring whether the system worked at all. Lessons in the ledger. Today, we tend to dismiss bureaucracy as dull. We imagine that the great moments of history happen on battlefields, not in offices filled with ledgers and weights and shipment receipts. But empires don't die from invasion alone. They die when the paperwork is no longer worth filling out, when the grain no longer arrives, when the people quietly stop believing the state will deliver the next loaf. The Roman grain dole was a masterpiece of organization, but it was also a fragile trust one that lasted longer than almost any political institution in Rome. And when that trust was broken, the city changed forever. Final reflection. The end of the grain dole wasn't just about food. It was about the collapse of civic structure. We remember emperors, battles, and monuments. But behind it all were the anonymous clerks, porters, and scribes who kept the empire fed. And perhaps that's the quietest tragedy of all. That Rome survived so long on the backs of administrators, only to forget them when the last ships failed to sail. Story 3. The Aqua Appia and the Roman water obsession. Picture this: a trickle of water flows through a stone-lined channel, barely wide enough to fit a grown man's shoulders. It winds under streets and past markets, quietly humming beneath the daily life of a bustling Roman city. There are no grand fountains, no marble basins, no mosaics of dolphins or sea gods. Just water, cool, quiet, controlled. It is 312 BCE. And this trickle is the beginning of one of Rome's most enduring obsessions: plumbing. This is the story of the Aqua Appia, the first Roman aqueduct. Not the most famous, not the grandest, but the one that started it all. And like many Roman achievements, it began not with ambition, but with a basic problem. The city was thirsty. Rome before the pipes. Before the aqueducts, Rome's water supply was a daily inconvenience. Citizens depended on rainwater collected in cisterns, wells often brackish or inconsistent, the Tiber River, which was polluted even in ancient times. Rome was a growing city with military needs, religious rituals, public baths, and a population that increasingly expected access to clean water. But without a reliable supply, even simple tasks, washing clothes, preparing food, watering livestock, became labor-intensive. Worse still, water meant power. Control over access meant control over the people. And Rome, ever fond of conquest, was finally ready to conquer its own geography. The censor who dug a revolution. Enter Appius Claudius Caecus, a man whose name you may not know, but whose impact is still running beneath modern-day Rome. Appius was appointed censor in 312 BCE. His job was to oversee the census, moral behavior, and public infrastructure. Most censors focused on roads or legal reforms. Appius did both and more. He built the Via Appia, the first great Roman road, and commissioned the Aqua Appia, the city's first aqueduct. The decision was bold. At the time, aqueducts weren't common outside the Greek world. Underground channels existed, but nothing on the scale Appius envisioned. He proposed tapping a spring east of the city and channeling the water via a mostly underground route, avoiding theft, pollution, and sabotage. It was 16.5 kilometers long, built of stone slabs and lead-lined channels, mostly underground. No arches, no grand bridges, just a quiet system that moved water from countryside to city, out of sight and mind. In short, it was the opposite of Roman spectacle. And yet it changed everything. a city learning to flow. With the Aqua Appia, Rome took its first step into hydraulic governance. Public fountains emerged, fed by constant flow. Bathhouses began to expand, relying on fresh water rather than reused Tiber water. Military camps, forums, and temples now had dedicated water sources. The convenience was transformative, but so was the control. The state now owned the water and could regulate it. Water inspectors, called curators aquarum, began tracking flow rates, overseeing maintenance, and punishing illegal taps. Yes, illegal taps. From the very beginning, some Romans began diverting public water into private gardens, pools, and bathhouses. It became so common that entire sections of the water code had to be carved in stone to regulate it. Appius had accidentally created not just infrastructure, but a regulatory bureaucracy, one that would grow for the next 600 years. The politics of pipes. Appius Claudius may have been a censor, but his legacy was undeniably political. The Aqua Appia did more than hydrate Rome, it established infrastructure as ideology. Why? Because water was universal. Unlike roads or walls, water touched everyone, rich and poor, patrician and plebeian. By building a system that served all Roman citizens, Appius sent a subtle but powerful message. The Republic provides, the Republic is civilized, the Republic flows. His aqueduct became an argument against his rivals, who accused him of extravagance or overreach. He countered that public access to water was a moral good, and that denying it was akin to denying life itself. In later generations, this principle would expand. Emperors and magistrates funded aqueducts not just for utility, but to demonstrate legitimacy. To rule well meant to supply water well. And it all began with a modest underground channel and a single spring. Water as urban identity. As the Aqua Appia continued its quiet work, it gradually altered how Romans thought about the city itself. Rome was no longer a place dependent on the river or seasonal rains. It was a place where water arrived on schedule, on purpose, and on principle. The aqueduct redefined civic space. Neighborhoods clustered around fountains. Markets expanded thanks to better sanitation. Temples boasted purified basins for rituals. And yet this transformation was almost invisible. There were no towering arches, no triumphal inscriptions. The Aqua Appia snaked beneath the city like a hidden promise. But make no mistake, Rome was becoming something different. Not just a city of stone and senators, but a city of systems. A city that planned for tomorrow, not just today. The hidden engineers who built the Aqua Appia. We don't know their names. They were slaves, laborers, surveyors, and foreign engineers, many likely influenced by Etruscan or Greek waterworks. They dug by hand, lined channels with stone, sealed joints with lime, and crawled through narrow tunnels for months in damp darkness. They worked in silence. They received no monuments, but without them there would have been no aqueducts, no public baths, no fountains, no Rome as we remember it. Their work was slow, boring even, but it endured. Portions of the original Aqua Appia were still in use over 400 years later. Few empires can claim that kind of infrastructural lifespan. An aqueduct or a quiet revolution. It's easy to overlook the Aqua Appia. It wasn't beautiful. It didn't dominate the skyline. It didn't flow over elegant arches or pour into marble basins. But that's precisely why it mattered. Rome didn't begin with grandeur. It began with necessity. With a single pipe, a spring, a channel, a plan. And in that plan was the seed of something much bigger. The idea that a city could be engineered, regulated, and nourished not by gods, but by people. That power could flow not through palaces, but through pipes. And so, the most influential infrastructure project in Roman history began without a single column or statue. just water and the will to move it. But the story doesn't end there. Rome would go on to build dozens of aqueducts, each more ambitious than the last. Some would cross valleys, others would climb mountains. One would stretch over 90 kilometers, carrying water from distant hills to the heart of the city. So here's the question. Did Rome's obsession with water make it stronger or simply more vulnerable? When you build a city that depends on distant springs flowing through fragile pipes, do you create stability or a hidden weakness? You wake up in a Roman tenement, a cramped insula rising several stories above the street. The morning sun glints off clay tiles. Outside, the neighborhood is already alive, vendors calling out fish prices, children chasing each other through narrow alleys. You look down from your window at the public fountain where, like clockwork, a small stream of water pours from a lion's head into a stone basin. That stream didn't come from a river. It came from dozens of kilometers away, over hills, through tunnels, across valleys, and into your street. It came through airborne arches and underground arteries. It came through the aqueducts of Rome. The Aqua Appia had laid the groundwork, but Rome wasn't done. Not by a long shot. In the centuries that followed, Rome's relationship with water would evolve from practical to grandiose. Aqueducts would grow longer, taller, more visible, and what began as a humble solution would become a full-blown imperial obsession. The growth of the system. After the success of the Aqua Appia, Rome built Aqua Anio Vetus, 272 BCE. Aqua Marcia, 144 BCE. Aqua Tepula, Aqua Julia, and many more, culminating in nearly 11 major aqueducts by the 3rd century CE. Each new project reflected not only growing demand but also technological ambition. Rome wasn't just supplying water, it was showcasing its engineering ideology. It was saying, we can make nature serve the city. Some of these aqueducts traveled over 60 km from their sources. The Aqua Marcia, one of the longest, brought cold, clean water from the Anio River Valley, a full 91 km away. But Rome didn't just build longer, it built higher. This is when the aqueduct truly entered the Roman skyline, not as a buried pipe, but as an architectural statement. The arches, function meets spectacle. Walk the Via Appia today, and you'll still see them, rows of arches, marching across the countryside like an endless stone centipede. Some are over 30 meters tall, supporting a narrow channel just wide enough for water and a maintenance crawlway. These weren't just functional, they were symbols. Rome didn't need to build aqueducts above ground. Tunneling was possible, albeit slower, but arches allowed aqueducts to defy topography, crossing valleys and uneven terrain while showing off Roman dominance over nature. To a Roman citizen, these arches weren't boring infrastructure. They were proof of empire, evidence that even water could be tamed, channeled, and made regular. And they weren't hidden away. Arches were built along major roads. They passed through city gates. They intersected markets and forums. Water, once a quiet presence, became a spectacle. How it worked inside the Roman aqueduct. Roman aqueducts were gravity-fed systems. That's right, no pumps, no motors. Just the subtle force of downhill slope, carefully calculated over dozens of kilometers. The slope had to be exact. Too steep, and the water would erode the channel. Too shallow, and the flow would stop. Roman engineers usually built aqueducts with a gradient of 1 in 4,800, barely noticeable, but enough to keep the water moving. Inside the channel, waterproof cement opus signum lined the stone. Occasional settling tanks allowed debris to fall out. Ventilation shafts allowed air pressure to escape. Bridges and tunnels navigated valleys and hills. Maintenance crews, known as aquarii, regularly entered the channels to clear silt, patch leaks, and remove blockages. Their work was tedious, invisible, and vital. Inscriptions sometimes honored them, though rarely by name. Again, Rome's real heroes were bureaucrats in sandals. Public versus private, who owned the water? As the aqueduct system expanded, so did the questions. Who was allowed to tap into it, and how much? At first, all aqueduct water was state-owned. It was delivered to public fountains, bathhouses, temples, military installations. But wealthy Romans began requesting access first informally, then through bribery, and eventually through official privileges. By the 1st century CE, private villas had pipes tapping aqueducts. Some even had running fountains, ornamental pools, and even primitive indoor plumbing. The state tried to regulate this through licenses and taxes. Illegal taps became a major issue. Wealthy families would quietly break into the channel with lead pipes bearing their name. Inspectors were tasked with rooting them out, sometimes chiseling off the names and sealing the taps. Yes, ancient Rome had plumbing crime. The baths, where it all came together. The most spectacular use of water in Rome was in the public baths. These were more than just places to wash, they were social centers, health clubs, libraries, and theaters all in one. Baths like the Thermae of Caracalla or the baths of Diocletian consumed millions of liters of water per day. Aqueducts delivered this water to Frigidaria, cold rooms; Tepidaria, warm rooms; Caldaria, hot rooms. The water was heated using furnaces beneath the floors, then flushed and replenished through aqueduct-fed systems. And here's the twist: water was rarely reused. Clean water in, dirty water out. The system relied on volume, not conservation. Rome had so much water coming in that waste wasn't a concern until later. Water and social control. By now, aqueducts were more than engineering marvels. They were political instruments. Emperors like Augustus, Claudius, and Trajan used aqueducts to gain popularity, showcase imperial benevolence, undercut the Senate's authority. Providing water was seen as a ruler's responsibility. Aqueducts, baths, and fountains bore inscriptions, from the emperor to the people. The implication was clear: your comfort comes from me, not the republic. And so, water flowed, and with it loyalty. Behind the glory, the men who kept it flowing. All of this required a massive support system. Surveyors who mapped routes across uneven terrain. Engineers who designed bridges and siphons. Stonemasons who built arches one block at a time. Laborers who dug, lifted, carried, and repaired. Administrators who filed reports and tracked leaks. The chief overseer of all aqueducts was the curator aquarum, a high-ranking official with a small army of workers beneath him. In the 1st century CE, the post was held by none other than Sextus Julius Frontinus, who wrote the definitive treatise De Aquis Urbis Romi on the waters of the city of Rome. In it, he lays out in excruciating detail the routes, capacities, and maintenance needs of each aqueduct. Frontinus didn't seek fame, he sought order. His book is one of the most precise technical manuals from the ancient world. It's also dry, repetitive, and bureaucratic, which makes it perfectly Roman. How much water did Rome use? At its peak, Rome's aqueducts delivered up to 1 billion liters, 264 million gallons per day. That's more per capita than modern New York City. Most of this water went to public use, not private luxury. Fountains ran constantly, baths were refreshed daily, even sewer systems benefited from aqueduct overflow. Rome was drenched in engineered abundance, and every drop flowed from a carefully managed system of gravity, stone, and spreadsheets. The hidden question. But by building so big, Rome raised a question it never fully answered. Could this system survive stress? Rome's water supply depended on distant sources, constant maintenance, political stability, What would happen if the pipes cracked, the records were lost, or the flow stopped? And more importantly, had Rome created a city so dependent on invisible infrastructure that it no longer knew how to live without it? There's a moment, centuries after Rome's peak, when a traveler enters the city and is stunned by the silence. Not political silence, not military calm, but a different kind of hush. The fountains are dry. Where once water sang over marble basins, now there is only dust. The public baths are shuttered. The channels, those engineering veins of the empire, are clogged with debris, weeds, and neglect. The aqueducts still cast shadows across the hills, but they no longer carry the lifeblood of the city. Rome's greatest achievement had become a skeleton. This is the story of how the aqueducts failed, how the city forgot how to flow, and what was left behind when the taps turned off. The fragility beneath the stone. Rome's aqueducts were marvels of engineering, but they were also fragile systems masquerading as eternal infrastructure. To work properly, aqueducts required regular cleaning to prevent buildup of calcium deposits, called sinter, maintenance of mortar seals, especially at joints and bends, constant monitoring of gradient and flow pressure, protection from theft, sabotage, or illegal tapping. They were living systems, only functional when someone was always watching. And as the 4th and 5th centuries progressed, fewer people were watching. The administrative decay. The decline didn't happen in a single moment. It was a slow erosion, a bureaucratic fatting. As the Western Roman Empire weakened, several things happened. Funding dried up. The state had fewer tax revenues, grain shipments slowed, salaries were unpaid, the maintenance crews shrank. Skilled labor declined. The equarii, those trained in repair, surveying, and channel cleaning, were no longer trained in sufficient numbers. Their work became forgotten knowledge. Corruption rose. Officials in charge of water management sold off public access to private clients or neglected inspections altogether. Military priorities overtook civic ones. Protecting borders mattered more than fixing leaks. And so the water still flowed, but less reliably. Some aqueducts fell into disrepair. Others collapsed in storms or earthquakes and were never rebuilt. The records, those precious charts of valves, routes, and flow rates, were misplaced, lost, or destroyed in fires. And without records, the system couldn't be fixed. The siege that broke the flow. In 537 CE, Rome came under siege not by barbarian tribes this time, but by a Byzantine-Roman war. The city was caught between the armies of the Eastern Emperor Justinian and the Goths of Italy. During the siege, the Gothic king Witiges ordered the aqueducts cut, knowing they provided not just drinking water, but powered grain mills and filled defensive moats. The Aqua Claudia and the Annio Novus, once triumphs of Claudius, were deliberately broken. Their arches still stood, but their channels were shattered. Without water, the city's mills stopped. Bathing ceased. Disease spread. Morale plummeted. Rome, once built on abundance, was reduced to well water and buckets. After the siege, some aqueducts were partially repaired, but never to their former capacity. Many remained broken for centuries. The baths become ruins. With the water gone, the bathhouses died. These buildings, once symbols of Roman social life, became hollowed-out shells, their furnaces cold, their marble cracked, their pools dry. Plants grew in caldaria, birds nested in frigidaria, people scavenged metal fittings and statues for scrap. By the 7th century, the average Roman had never been inside a functioning bathhouse. The culture of bathing, cleanliness, and social gathering eroded into a memory told through crumbling architecture. The fountains go silent. The public fountains, Lacus and salients, once present in every neighborhood, ceased functioning. Without constant flow, they became stagnant pools, then dry basins. Some were repurposed as shrines. Others were buried by sediment and forgotten. A few survived as ghost features, embedded in churches or medieval walls. And yet the streets still carried their names. Via della Fontana, Piazza Acqua Marcia, echoes of water no one remembered. Rome without water. This was not the first time a great civilization lost its infrastructure. But Rome's collapse was unique because its infrastructure was inseparable from its identity. Without water, Rome's population dropped from over 1 million to under 50,000. Markets shrank, neighborhoods emptied. The Tiber, once a backup, became a source of disease. Medieval visitors were stunned by the ruins, colossal aqueducts still standing but dry. It was like seeing the veins of a dead god. And the worst part, no one could explain how it all worked anymore. Rome had become a city living in the shell of forgotten engineering, memory, and rediscovery. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, Rome's water obsession awoke again. Humanist scholars like Flavio Biondo and architects like Leon Battista Alberti began studying ancient ruins. They traced aqueducts, measured their gradients, marveled at how they had worked. Pope Nicholas V in the 15th century began restoring the Aqua Virgo, bringing clean water to Rome again over 900 years after the last full flow. And in doing so, he revived not just the fountains but the memory of an empire that had once made water its most essential public promise. The aqueduct as metaphor. Rome's water system teaches a profound historical lesson. Civilization isn't just art and war and politics. It's infrastructure. It's maintenance. It's knowing where the pipe goes and checking that it still works. Rome fell in part because it stopped maintaining the boring things. The aqueducts didn't fail suddenly. They failed because no one inspected the cracks, because the engineers weren't replaced, because the reports were never filed. Reflection, the city that forgot to flow. In the end, the Aqua Appia was more than stone and water. It was a philosophy that cities should serve their people, that public access matters, that greatness lies in the daily and the dull. Rome once mastered that philosophy. Then it forgot. But its bones remain, arches stretching across forgotten fields, silent channels running beneath modern streets. The systems are gone, but the memory still flows. So next time you turn on a tap, walk past a water main, or ignore the pipework beneath your city, remember Rome. And remember that even empires can run dry. Story 4. Gaius Gracchus and the Curse of Land Reform. Imagine walking along a dusty road in the Italian countryside in the 2nd century BCE. The land stretches out in every direction: olive groves, wheat fields, and sheep pastures baking under a dry sun. But you notice something odd. Some fields are alive with work, dotted with small huts and farmers. Others are silent, owned by absentee landlords who have never touched the soil. And still others are worked by slaves in chains, their overseers lounging under shade. This is not a snapshot of inequality. It is the central problem of the Roman Republic, a problem that would drive politics for over a century, a problem that would help unravel the Republic itself. At the heart of this problem was land and the long, strange, tragic career of a man named Gaius Gracchus, whose attempt to fix it became Rome's most persistent curse. The Gracchi family and the burden of reform. To understand Gaius, we must begin with his brother, Tiberius Gracchus. In 133 BCE, Tiberius proposed a radical idea, at least by Roman standards: enforce the existing law. There were laws on the books centuries old that limited how much public land, called ager publicus, a single citizen could farm. In theory, no one was allowed more than 500 aegera, about 300 acres. But in reality, wealthy elites ignored the rule. Over decades, they had swallowed up massive estates, pushing smallholders off the land and replacing them with slaves. Tiberius Gracchus sought to redistribute some of that land back to poor citizens, landless veterans, struggling farmers, even the urban poor. He passed his law, he bypassed the Senate, and within a year, he was murdered by a mob of senators, beaten to death with benches and thrown into the Tiber. Enter Gaius Gracchus. Gaius the administrator. Gaius wasn't just passionate, he was methodical. Where Tiberius had been fiery, Gaius was organized. He entered Roman politics not as a martyr's brother, but as a praetor, and later as a tribune of the plebs in 123 BCE. His goal, not just land reform but systemic reform. Gaius believed the problem wasn't just property, it was Rome's entire structure of public administration. And so he proposed a series of reforms that were detailed, technical, and shockingly modern. The lex fermentaria, cheap grain for citizens. Gaius recognized that many of Rome's poor were no longer rural farmers but urban workers who had no access to land. So he proposed the lex fermentaria, a law mandating that grain be sold at a fixed subsidized price to Roman citizens. It was not free grain that would come later, but it was predictable, affordable, and state-run. The idea was simple. If citizens could rely on cheap food, they would be less likely to riot, less vulnerable to political bribery, and more stable overall. Critics hated it. They claimed it would bankrupt the treasury. Supporters loved it. They said it made citizenship mean something. Gaius, without knowing it, had helped lay the groundwork for Rome's future grain, dole the very system that would persist for centuries. Colonization and infrastructure. Land reform wasn't just about redistributing Italian fields. Gaius also proposed founding new colony settlements of Roman citizens on newly conquered or underused land across the Mediterranean. His most famous plan was for a colony at Carthage, on the ruins of Rome's old enemy. To support this plan, he oversaw the construction of roads, granaries, and bridges projects that not only boosted the economy, but also connected Rome's rural citizens with its urban markets. He essentially became a minister of infrastructure. But with every new initiative, the elite grew more uncomfortable. The curse of enforcement. The true problem was Gaius's ideas. It was their implementation. Redistributing land meant surveying it. Surveying it meant confronting powerful landowners. And confronting landowners meant conflict. Gaius established land commissions to enforce redistribution, staffed by bureaucrats empowered to reclaim illegally held land and resettle citizens on new plots. But the process was slow, messy, contested. Records were missing. Boundaries were unclear. Families refused to move. It was, in every way, a bureaucratic nightmare, and yet it was the most serious attempt Rome had ever made to fix the rural imbalance that had been growing for decades. A new political reality. Gaius' reforms extended beyond land and grain. He also reformed the courts, removing corrupt senators from juries and replacing them with equestrians, Rome's upper middle class. Regulated military service, mandating that soldiers receive equipment from the state. Challenged the Senate's control over provincial administration, especially in tax collection. These policies made him deeply popular with ordinary citizens, but deeply dangerous to the ruling class. His political enemies began to organize. They courted the mob with counter-bribes, rival grain promises, and fear tactics. And just like with his brother, the winds began to shift. The fall of Gaius Gracchus. In 121 BCE, violence broke out during one of Gaius' public assemblies. The Senate passed the infamous Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a vague declaration granting final authority to consuls in times of crisis. In practice, it meant permission to use force against anyone deemed a threat to the Republic. Gaius fled to the Aventine Hill. He refused to raise a rebel army. He refused to take up arms. He waited. And when he saw the end coming, he ordered his own slave to kill him, choosing death over dishonor. His body was decapitated. His head, according to rumor, was filled with molten gold by bounty hunters. Aftermath: the land stays broken. Here is the bitter truth. Gaius Gracchus achieved more in life than most reformers, and yet his reforms were almost entirely undone within a decade. The land redistribution stalled. The colonies failed. The legal reforms were reversed. The price of grain continued to climb. But something deeper remained: the idea that land and who controls it was Rome's fundamental fault line. And this fault line would never go away. A curse repeated. After Gaius, land reform became a repeating tragedy in Roman politics. Sulla, decades later, would claim to resettle soldiers by confiscating land through violence. Pompey and Crassus tried land laws for veterans, but got bogged down in legal disputes. Julius Caesar promised land to his soldiers and used that promise to march on Rome. Augustus, in the wake of civil war, would finally fulfill the redistribution, but at the cost of abandoning the republic altogether. In each case, the language of Gaius Gracchus echoed in the background. But the curse of Roman land was this: no solution stuck. The land was always too uneven. The elite always too powerful. The laws always too easy to bend. And so, long after Gaius was dead, Rome kept reliving the same debate. Who deserves the land? Who has too much? What does the republic owe to its citizens? Closing thought. Gaius Gracchus didn't die for a dream. He died for an Excel spreadsheet. A column of names, a list of plots, a bureaucratic hope that the system could be repaired from within. But land once stolen, inherited, or hoarded rarely returns to the people easily. And perhaps Rome was never ready to be fixed. Imagine Rome not in marble but in papyrus, not the forum's grandeur but the cramped backrooms of administrative offices, tables stacked with tablets, scrolls, ink pots, and land surveys. Tired officials with calloused fingers mark names off long registries. There are no cheering crowds, no triumphal marches, just measurements, ledgers, disputes. This was the real battlefield of land reform, and this is where Gaius Gracchus' revolution began to slow down. He had the votes, he had the vision, but what he also had, what every Roman reformer eventually faced, was a system designed to resist change. The land commissions, dreams in wax and wood. When Gaius Gracchus passed his reforms, the Senate reluctantly allowed the establishment of land commissions, decemviri agris dandis et signandis. These boards were responsible for identifying public land ager publicus, seizing illegally held estates, and redistributing parcels to citizens. But here was the problem. The land had been held illegally for generations. Boundaries were poorly recorded. Inheritance claims, local corruption, and sheer confusion made each case a legal puzzle. Surveyors were in short supply. Maps were incomplete, if they existed at all. These commissions worked slowly, often remeasuring fields already in dispute. A single parcel could involve multiple claimants, missing tax records, and reluctant neighbors. And while the poor waited for plots, the rich filed appeals, injunctions, and petitions, bogging the process in endless litigation. Gaius had promised land. What he delivered, at least to many, was paperwork. The politics of resettlement. Even when land was successfully reassigned, it wasn't always welcomed. Consider: some citizens assigned new land were city dwellers, unaccustomed to rural life. Others were veterans, used to command and not inclined to start over as subsistence farmers. The land itself was often marginal, hilly, far from markets, poorly irrigated. There were no state-sponsored support programs, no seed, no plows, no protection. This wasn't a handout, it was a gamble. Many citizens, especially in remote areas, abandoned their plots and returned to the city. Their small farms were quietly absorbed again, either legally or illegally, by nearby landlords. In this way, redistribution became a loop. Land was assigned, claimed, abandoned, and reclaimed by elites. A legal maze. To administer the land reforms, Gaius, administration relied on existing Roman law, a complicated, evolving mix of custom, statute, and precedent. Disputes over land ownership were handled by praetors, often influenced by politics, bribes, or favoritism. Courts were overwhelmed. Land deeds required verification, witnesses, and registration at the local level. But many regions didn't have the infrastructure for such record keeping. In rural areas, land was still measured in paces and marked by trees or stones, not formal boundaries. Errors were inevitable, falsification common, resistance subtle. And yet the Gracchan bureaucracy pressed on, creating more forms, more clerks, more offices. It was, in many ways, the birth of the Roman administrative state. And like all bureaucracies, it became the enemy of its own mission. The Senate pushes back. As the commission stumbled, the optimates, the conservative, senatorial elite, grew more aggressive. They disputed the legality of the commissions themselves, pressured local magistrates to stall enforcement, encouraged public backlash by warning of civil unrest, planted agents to disrupt town meetings and incite protests. The Senate began to paint Gaius as a tyrant in disguise, a man obsessed with centralizing power and eroding tradition. They warned that his colonies would drain Rome's resources, that his laws undermined the Senate's authority, and that his reforms created a permanent underclass dependent on the state. Fear, not logic, was their strongest weapon. And in Roman politics, fear could move faster than any commission. The tragedy of Carthage. Among Gaius' most controversial ideas was the founding of a Roman colony at Carthage, the North African city destroyed in 146 BCE after the Third Punic War. His plan was ambitious: 6,000 settlers, new roads and granaries, restored fields and harbors. He called it Junonia, and it was to be a model of Roman resettlement. But to conservatives, building on the ashes of Rome's hated enemy was an abomination, a religious violation, a breach of sacred memory. Rumors swirled that wolves had attacked workers at the site, that the gods rejected the colony, that the place was cursed. The Senate used this backlash to discredit Gaius. His once strong public support began to erode. Even allies grew quiet. In trying to build a symbol of renewal, he had handed his enemies a tool for fear-mongering. The new tribunate, a dangerous rival. Gaius made a critical error. He tried to run for a third tribunate, breaking with tradition and inviting charges of ambition. A rival tribune, Lucius Opimius, was backed by the Senate. Opimius campaigned not just against Gaius' policies, but against the entire reform movement. He promised to repeal the Junonia colony, to dissolve the land commissions, to restore order. His message, enough is enough. And Rome, weary of unrest, listened. The end of the land movement. By 121 BCE, Gaius was cornered. A political confrontation turned violent. The Senate issued the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, essentially martial law. Troops were deployed. Gaius fled, was trapped, and died by suicide, his reforms unraveling behind him. After his death, the land commissions were disbanded. Ongoing land surveys were halted. Public land claims were quietly shelved. The records gathered tens of thousands of names, deeds, measurements were locked away or lost. And the land, it returned to the few. The curse unbroken. Here's the great irony. Gaius Gracchus did more than anyone to expose Rome's land crisis. But by trying to fix it through the law, through process, through bureaucracy, he also cemented its intractability. After him, land became a political weapon, not a policy. Promises were made to gain votes. Plots were handed out to soldiers as patronage. But no one tried again to systematically address the imbalance. The smallholder class, the backbone of the old republic, continued to shrink. The large estates worked by slaves continued to grow. And by the time Julius Caesar came to power, land reform was no longer about fairness. It was about loyalty. A paper legacy. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Gaius Gracchus lies not in the fields, but in the files. His use of state-administered grain, his detailed legal reforms, his administrative infrastructure, his belief in the power of writing things down. For better or worse, Gaius helped turn Roman politics into a system that could be manipulated, yes, but also measured. He created the blueprint for state bureaucracy. And then he was killed by the people that bureaucracy tried to serve. But here's the question. Did Gaius fail because his ideas were flawed? Or because his methods, rational, administrative, legal, were no match for a political world ruled by violence and fear? Rome's streets are calm now. The Senate has reconvened. The reformers are gone. Their laws erased. Their records burned or forgotten. Grain prices return to market fluctuation. The crowds no longer chant names. The columns of newly surveyed farmland sit idle, names faded, boundaries swallowed by estate fences and forgotten ditches. But beneath it all, the land hasn't forgotten. This is not just the story of Gaius Gracchus. This is the story of a republic whose soil was soaked not only in blood but in bureaucracy, ambition, and betrayal. The curse of land reform wasn't just that it failed. It was that it could never be allowed to succeed. What the Gracchi uncovered. By the time Gaius Gracchus died, the shape of the Roman Republic had already shifted. He and his brother had pulled back the curtain, exposing truths that made the aristocracy uncomfortable. That Rome's economic engine was broken, dependent on slave labor, declining citizen farmers, and exploitative estate holders. That citizenship was being hollowed out, with rights meaningless in the face of property inequality. That the Republic's laws existed only to the extent the Senate chose to enforce them. The Gracchi didn't invent these problems. They just refused to pretend they weren't there. And that refusal, so audacious, so public, created a new kind of threat. Not rebellion, but reform. The return of inequality. With the Gracchi commissions dissolved and the land laws repealed or ignored, latifundia, large private estates, spread across Italy. Smallholders found it harder and harder to compete with the efficiencies of slave-powered estates. Many migrated to Rome, swelling the urban population and increasing dependency on state-subsidized grain. The military struggled to recruit property-owning soldiers, leading to further changes in how Rome staffed its legions. The countryside, once dotted with independent farmers, became increasingly empty of citizens. The long-term impact was subtle but profound. The Republic lost its rural base, its moderate middle, and with it, its capacity for resilient, representative politics. Land, the source of freedom in Roman political theory, had become the tool of domination. Land and the army, a new transaction. After Gaius, the next land reformers would not be tribunes with paperwork. They would be generals with swords. Beginning with Gaius Marius, Rome's military reforms shifted the burden of recruitment away from land-owning citizens. Instead, landless men were allowed to serve, with the promise of land as payment after service. It was a deal that redefined the Roman military. Soldiers no longer fought for the Republic, they fought for commanders who could deliver land grants. Generals became political brokers, trading conquest for loyalty. Land became a currency of personal allegiance, not public policy. The Republic had avoided Gracchan-style redistribution through bureaucracy, only to invite it back through military clientelism. Julius Caesar and the Gracchan inheritance. When Julius Caesar came to power in the mid-1st century BCE, he revived land reform, but not for justice, for control. He pushed through colonization programs, settled tens of thousands of veterans, and used land grants as a carrot to maintain political dominance. But Caesar's land policies were not aimed at creating equity. They were aimed at creating stability and, more importantly, dependence. The lesson of the Gracchi had not been forgotten. Caesar studied their reforms and what had happened to the reformers. So he bypassed the Senate, he forced votes, and when resistance came, he crossed the Rubicon. Land, again, had become the foundation of civil war. Augustus and the final consolidation. After decades of war, Augustus, Rome's first emperor, used land reform to finalize his authority. He redistributed land to his loyal veterans, created new colonies to relieve urban overcrowding, regularized land titles across Italy and the provinces, centralized control of ager publicus, ending centuries of ad hoc seizures and client-based distributions. In doing so, Augustus ended the Republic's most persistent debate not by solving it, but by removing it from public hands. Under the empire, land was no longer debated in the forum. It was assigned from the palace. The Gracchi's dream of a fairer system wasn't fulfilled. It was absorbed, neutralized by imperial administration. And that, perhaps, was the final twist in the curse. The Gracchan legacy. Despite their political failures, the Gracchi left a lasting mark. They introduced the idea that the state had a responsibility to address inequality. They established a legal bureaucratic framework for reform, which was adapted and reused by emperors. They forced Rome to see the cost of its own inequality. Cicero, writing years later, remained wary of them. He called their efforts destabilizing, but acknowledged their rhetorical power. Plutarch praised their intentions, even while condemning their fates. And later reformers, emperors, jurists, administrators continued to reference their names. They had become a symbol, both feared and admired. The curse itself. So what was the curse? It wasn't a literal one, not a spell or a myth. The curse of Gaius Gracchus was a structural one. That Rome's social and political system had created a problem it could neither fully acknowledge nor afford to fix. Land was too central, too symbolic, too entangled with class, military, and citizenship. To fix land meant to challenge the very definition of Roman power. And no republic, not even one as grand as Rome, was ready for that. Final reflection, paper over plow. When we think of revolutions, we often imagine fire and shouting. But Gaius Gracchus's revolution was made of ink and wax, legal clauses and boundary stones, public tokens and grain ledgers, scribes, clerks, and commissioners. It was boring, tedious, fragile. And yet it threatened to change everything. Because for a brief moment, the Roman Republic looked at its land not as conquest, not as spoils, but as a shared civic resource. And that was an idea too radical to survive. Story 5. The Aediles and the Sewer Maintenance Files. You might think Roman greatness was built on conquest, politics, or architecture. But there's another Rome, a quieter, damper Rome that flows beneath the marble. A Rome of runoff and refuse, where every drop of water told a story. Welcome to the world of the Aediles, Rome's most underappreciated public servants. Before Caesar crossed the Rubicon, before Cicero gave his first oration. Rome was held together by the Cloaca Maxima, the city's great sewer, and the bureaucrats who kept it from collapsing. Their story is not a glamorous one. It is a story of drainage, graffiti removal, food inspection, and festival permits. And yet, this boring, administrative class played a role in preventing Rome from sinking into filth, fire, and chaos. Who were the aediles? The aediles from Aedes, meaning temple or building, were elected magistrates responsible for maintaining public buildings, overseeing the food supply, organizing public games and festivals, managing urban sanitation, inspecting markets and waits, ensuring street cleanliness and repairs, keeping the peace in marketplaces. There were typically 4 aediles at a time, 2 curule aediles, open to patricians and plebeians, and 2 plebeian aediles, only for plebeians. While higher offices like consul or praetor brought military commands or legislative power, the aediles dealt with spoiled meat and broken fountains. But in a city of 1 million people, their job was essential. Cloaca Maxima, Rome's underground marvel. Rome's famous sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, was one of the world's oldest and most ambitious sanitation systems. Originally built in the 6th century BCE during the reign of Tarquinius Priscus, expanded and maintained through the Republic and into the Empire, channeled stormwater and waste into the Tiber River, lined with stone and large enough in places for a man to stand upright, frequently inspected and repaired by order of the aediles. It connected to countless smaller drains, latrines, bathhouses, and fountains. Think of it as a living, breathing circulatory system for the city's health. And when it failed, people noticed streets flooded, diseases spread, and tempers rose. A day in the life of an aedile. Imagine the schedule of a Roman aedile in 92 BCE. Dawn, inspect the cattle stalls near the Forum Boarium. One merchant is fined for selling diseased meat. Another's scale is confiscated for being 7% off. Midday, meet engineers to discuss the blockage near the Subura district. Cloaca Maxima is backing up due to olive pits and pottery shards. Afternoon, issue permits for a new public latrine near the Aventine. Deny a request to build a wine stand too close to the Temple of Vesta. Evening, review applications from performers seeking inclusion in the Ludi Romani, Roman Games. Late night, quietly approve funds for the removal of offensive graffiti from a senator's villa wall. Not exactly Cicero's courtroom, but without this, Rome stops functioning. Inspecting the sewers. One of the oddities of Roman life was the expectation that elites, even young noblemen, would serve as aediles. And that meant getting dirty. Several ancient writers, including Pliny the Elder and Frontinus, note that aediles or their representatives would descend into sewer tunnels to inspect them directly. They looked for structural damage, illegal connections, businesses diverting runoff, corrosion or root growth, accumulated debris. There are records of aediles ordering fines, initiating cleanup projects, and even posting rewards for information about illegal waste dumping. In one case from the late Republic, an aedile ordered a tavern shut down because it was pouring kitchen waste directly into a street drain, causing a months-long stench that irritated local patricians. The cost of cleanliness. The aediles operated with limited funding. Rome had no central sanitation budget. Much of their success depended on personal initiative, local alliances, and creative bribery. Sometimes, ambitious aediles used their own money to build fountains or repair streets, hoping to win public favor. In fact, aedileship was often a stepping stone to higher office and opportunity to be seen as a man of the people, before running for praetor or consul. Julius Caesar used his term as aedile to throw lavish public games. Cicero, on the other hand, avoided the office entirely. It was too expensive and too dirty. But for those who accepted the post, public hygiene was a performance, and voters remembered those who kept the streets clean and the aqueducts flowing. Sanitation and superstition. Romans did not separate cleanliness from religion. Temples, shrines, and sacred spaces were required to remain pure, meaning no filth, no runoff, and no broken paving stones. The aediles often worked closely with pontiffs and augurs to ensure the urban environment met religious standards. In one recorded incident from 61 BCE, an aedile was fined for failing to prevent sewage overflow near a temple, which was interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure before a major military campaign. The mundane in Rome was always tied to the cosmic. Quiet catastrophes. Aediles dealt with what might be called quiet catastrophes. A blocked sewer that flooded a market. A cracked aqueduct that led to a water shortage. A rotting ox carcass left too long in the sun. A bakery using spoiled grain during a festival. Each incident, while unremarkable in isolation, could spiral into unrest. The grain riots of 57 BCE, for example, weren't just about food. They were sparked by a failure in port sanitation that delayed shipments. The port sewers were clogged, cleanup was late, grain rotted, people panicked. The aedile in charge was blamed, and public confidence collapsed. A forgotten heroism. To keep the world running in silence, that was the aedile's task. No oratory, no battlefield glory, just the eternal fight against filth, water, and time. They wrote no treatises, left no marble statues. And yet, it's likely that no office in Republican Rome had more direct contact with the daily life of citizens. Where the Senate debated policy, aediles debated how many men it would take to unclog a broken street drain without collapsing the curbside wine stall. They were Roman civilization's plumbers, inspectors, event planners, zoning officials, and sanitation engineers rolled into one underpaid magistrate. A closing thought. The Cloaca Maxima still flows today. Rainwater and runoff still slip beneath Rome's streets, passing through stone channels laid down thousands of years ago. Some parts of it are still functional, still carrying away what must be carried away. And though the aediles are long gone, their world, the one of maintenance, quiet vigilance, civic responsibility, remains the backbone of every functioning society. It is not glorious. It is not memorable. But it is absolutely essential. Let us now move from the damp world beneath the city to the chaotic streets above. Because while the Cloaca Maxima may have been the heart of Roman sanitation, the aedile's duties extended to every cracked paving stone, every sack of spoiled grain, and every half-erased insult scrawled on the walls of a tavern. This is not the glamorous Rome of marble forums and golden laurel wreaths. This is Rome as it was lived. And the aediles were the ones tasked with keeping it livable. The graffiti dilemma. Roman walls were covered in writing, political slogans, love notes, crude drawings, accusations of theft, poetic boasts, satirical jabs, advertisements for gladiator games or apartment rentals. And inevitably, insults. Graffiti was Rome's public internet. It was fast, vulgar, personal, and ubiquitous. Aediles had the unenviable job of deciding which graffiti could stay, and which had to be scraped off. Why? Offending a magistrate or priest could be seen as a civic insult. Slandering a citizen of standing could provoke lawsuits or duels. Erotic or obscene graffiti near temples could violate religious purity laws. Political graffiti, not sanctioned by the state, was technically illegal campaigning. Removal was labor-intensive. Walls had to be washed, plastered, or repainted. Offenders were rarely caught. Some aediles, overwhelmed, simply issued blanket warnings. All citizens are reminded that defacing walls near sacred precincts is punishable by fine. It didn't stop the scribblers, the grain markets and spoilage crisis. Of all the duties the aediles held, none was more essential or more volatile than overseeing the grain supply. Rome was fed by imports from Sicily, North Africa, and Egypt. Grain arrived at Ostia, then traveled upriver or overland. It was stored in Horea granaries, sold in markets, or distributed in the grain dole fermentatio. But the system was fragile. Ships were delayed by weather. Rats and mold infested warehouses. Price gouging and hoarding were rampant. Spoiled grain caused public illness and riots. Aediles had to inspect grain shipments, verify weights, ensure storage quality, and manage the grain distributions. They also had to balance tensions. If they cracked down too hard on sellers, they risked choking the market. If they were too lenient, the poor went hungry. If they failed altogether, they might face a mob outside the curia. One documented case from 73 BCE describes an aedile ordering a public burning of spoiled Egyptian grain. The smell sickened an entire district. The resulting panic led to a stampede in the market square, injuring dozens. And yet the grain still had to come. The people still had to eat. Fire, the eternal enemy. Before fire brigades, before emergency services, Rome burned frequently. Aediles were responsible for inspecting buildings for unsafe construction, rarely enforced, clearing combustible refuse in alleyways, ensuring water access for emergency response via public fountains, organizing ad hoc bucket brigades when fires broke out. Fires started in bakeries, taverns, bathhouses, tenements called insulae. These cramped wooden structures, often several stories tall, were built with little regard for safety. A single cooking pot left unattended could gut a city block. Aediles couldn't prevent fires, but they could penalize negligent landlords, fund repairs to public hydrants and basins, assign watchmen to high-risk areas, mobilize cleanup crews after the embers cooled. In 50 BCE, one aedile commissioned the paving of a notoriously fire-prone alley using city funds. He lost the next election. Too boring, they said. Too practical. Animal control, Roman style. The urban animal population was both vital and troublesome. Cattle and donkeys carried goods through the streets. Dogs roamed free, scavenging refuse. Rats infested drains and granaries. Sacred geese at temples were protected by law. Chickens, goats, and pigs were raised within city limits, often illegally. Aediles regulated slaughterhouse locations, licenses for animal vendors, fines for uncontained livestock in markets, the disposal of animal carcasses, often dumped in alleys. In one ordinance, an aedile prohibited pig slaughter near the forum during festival weeks. Another attempted, unsuccessfully, to impose a limit on the number of goats per household on the Aventine Hill. Aediles could fine owners, confiscate animals, or contract waste removal, but enforcement was spotty. Rome, after all, was a city where oxen shared alleyways with senators. Street maintenance and vendor disputes. Rome's streets were its veins, but they were often clogged. Vendors spread stalls far beyond their permits. Street musicians and performers drew crowds that blocked traffic. Water channels overflowed, eroding the paving stones. Cobblestones were stolen or used as weapons in fights. Aediles managed permits, oversaw repairs, and occasionally banned entire blocks of vendors after disputes turned violent. They were also responsible for nomming and policing the layout of streets, a difficult task in a city with poor signage, few maps, and constant renovations. At least one aedile reportedly redrew the boundary of a market street to favor his cousin's bakery. Another was caught charging bribes for prime vendor positions near temples. Still, without their intervention, the city's arteries would have seized up entirely. Politics in public spaces. Public spaces were always political in Rome. Aediles regulated political banners and campaign graffiti, public speeches in markets, distribution of pamphlets or manifestos, approval for temporary platforms or stages. During election season, every fountain, statue base, and column was covered in painted endorsements. Rival gangs would fight over chalked slogans or erase opposition messages. Aediles could fine campaign violators, though enforcement was inconsistent. Some aediles tried to stay neutral. Others, like Clodius Pulcher, used their office to turn street politics into full-scale populist machinery. Control the space, and you control the crowd. Control the crowd, and you control the vote. Administrative fatigue. By the late Republic, the aedileship had become a paradox. Essential but undervalued. Visible but unrewarded. Overworked but underfunded. Ambitious men often skipped the office entirely, aiming straight for tribune or praetor. In response, the duties of the aediles were increasingly outsourced to freedmen, hired contractors, or sub-magistrates. Accountability declined. And so the city limped forward. The pipes cracked. The streets crumbled. The fires spread. The graffiti returned. And still the city stood. A closing thought. The aediles, in many ways, represent the silent labor of civilization. No empire can survive on battles and speeches alone. Someone must take out the trash. Someone must inspect the grain. Someone must repaint the wall where someone else wrote, "Marcus is a liar and owes me 4 denarii." And so Rome endured filthy, fractious, magnificent. Not because of its emperors, but because a few overworked officials in dusty tunics filed the sewer reports, removed the rotting fruit, and fined the man who sold watered wine at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. They were not heroes. They were administrators. But without them, Rome would have drowned in its own excess. By the late imperial period, Rome was no longer the buzzing hub of energy it had once been. The political heart of the empire had moved east to Constantinople. The emperors now ruled from a distance, and the old republic's civic offices, those once held with pride, had become hollow titles. But the problems of the city did not go away. The drains still clogged. The animals still fouled the alleys. The people still gathered at the markets. Rome, though diminished, still needed to be managed. And yet, in this new world of imperial autocracy, who managed the filth? This is the quiet end of the aediles, how Rome's oldest urban caretakers faded into bureaucracy, and what that meant for a city that once prided itself on civic order. The decline of civic pride. Under the Republic, the aedileship was a launching point for ambitious men, a chance to prove one's worth through public works and visibility. By the 3rd century CE, however, the cursus honorum had decayed. Political posts were bought, not earned. Real power lay in the army or imperial court. The aediles still existed, but their influence was minimal. Their responsibilities were handed off to appointed bureaucrats who answered not to the Roman people, but to the praetorian prefect, or directly to the emperor. The civic spirit officium, civitates that once guided aediles, had become mere obligation. Where once men competed to beautify Rome, now they avoided the role altogether. Outsourcing the city. With noble families disinterested and lower-class citizens disempowered, urban management became increasingly outsourced. Freedmen and slaves managed market inspections and grain logistics. Military engineers occasionally took charge of sewer repairs. Private contractors swept streets, cleared refuse, and patrolled dangerous quarters. But the coordination once overseen by aediles who lived in and knew, the neighborhoods became fragmented. The city no longer had eyes everywhere. Emergencies were addressed only when they became public scandals or threatened elite interests. The city that had once functioned like a well-oiled mechanism now worked more like a patchwork of temporary fixes. When the sewers backed up, Rome's population had declined drastically from over 1 million to perhaps 100,000 or fewer by the 5th century CE. And yet its sewer system remained essential. Even reduced, the city produced tons of waste, human, animal, industrial. But few now understood the old systems. The aqueducts that once flushed the Cloaca Maxima were in disrepair. Illegal connections clogged channels. Tree roots cracked ancient tunnels. Maintenance was infrequent, slow, and underfunded. In 410 CE, when Alaric the Visigoth entered Rome, he did not destroy the sewer system. He didn't need to. The city was already rotting from below. After the sack, more records were lost. The names of minor drainage branches were forgotten. Maps vanished. The diagrams kept by aediles for centuries, meticulously updated, were burned or lost in the administrative collapse. It was no longer a question of who was cleaning the sewers. It was a question of whether anyone even knew how anymore. Fountains without water. Just as with sewers, Rome's fountains and basins relied on constant upkeep. Under the aediles, fountains had been cleared of sediment and algae, patrolled to prevent misuse or illegal drawing, used for firefighting and washing. Now many stood dry. The aqueducts, too, had suffered during sieges, neglect, and natural disaster. Some were deliberately severed by enemy forces during the Gothic Wars to weaken the city's defenses. Without fountains, water had to be hauled from the Tiber, public hygiene plummeted, bathhouses closed, disease spread. And the image of Rome, a city of marble and flowing water, became a cruel memory. The market without measures. With aediles gone, Rome's markets became unregulated spaces. Merchants cheated weights, prices soared and fell unpredictably. No one monitored food quality unless an outbreak occurred. The fermentatio, once a carefully managed public grain dole, became erratic. Under the Emperor Aurelian, reforms attempted to bring order back by re-centralizing food distribution. But without local oversight, corruption flourished. In the absence of aediles, small-scale local patrons, landowners, or church leaders began filling the vacuum, offering food or charity in exchange for loyalty. The Republic's ideal of public service was replaced with personal patronage. The last graffiti. Even graffiti changed. What had once been political or satirical was now desperate, religious, or superstitious. Prayers scratched into stone, "Save us from the fever, O St. Peter." Symbols of protection, like fish and anchors. Occasional curses against landlords or rival traders. No aedile came to wash these messages away. No one recorded their existence. No one fined the offenders. The streets no longer had caretakers. The walls no longer had readers. The messages faded with the paint. Echoes of the past. Despite the fall of the aediles, their administrative DNA remained. The church adopted many urban responsibilities, maintaining grain stores and organizing charity. Local bishops took over some festival planning and sanitation duties. Byzantine officials in the East continued to employ sewer supervisors and market inspectors, preserving fragments of the system. And even in post-Roman Europe, echoes remained. The title of Echevin in medieval France. The constables and aldermen of English towns. The urban prefects of Constantinople. All owe a small debt to the anonymous Roman aedile, the man who filed the drainage report before it was fashionable to do so. Final reflection, the backbone of civilization. So what do we make of the aediles? They were not heroes. They weren't visionaries. They weren't revolutionary or philosophers or generals, but they did something just as vital. They held the line not against invaders or tyrants, but against entropy. They were civilization's slow, steady defense against the forces of rot, rust, neglect, and indifference. And that defense, once abandoned, was nearly impossible to restore. Rome didn't collapse in a day. It decayed through the loss of the boring things: sewer charts, permit logs, stall inspections, grain ledgers. And at the heart of all those things was the aedile. Story 6. The Life and Ledgers of Licinius the Grain Clerk. You are standing in a shaded corner of the Roman Forum, not far from the Temple of Saturn. It's mid-morning. A long line of citizens winds around a modest building: men in tunics, boys in sandals, women with straw baskets. No one's shouting, no one's panicking, but every eye is locked on a single figure at a small wooden table. He doesn't wear a toga, he doesn't command attention. He dips his stylus into ink, looks over a clay tablet, scratches his neck. This is Licinius, one of Rome's countless grain clerks, and he's about to decide who gets to eat this week and who doesn't. Welcome to the fermentatio, the lifeblood of Rome's urban poor, and one of the most boring but vital administrative systems in ancient history. What was the fermentatio? The fermentatio was Rome's organized public distribution of grain, later expanded to include bread, oil, and wine under the empire. It was introduced in the late Republic as a political tool and quickly became an economic necessity. By the height of the program under Augustus, around 200,000 Roman citizens were enrolled to receive monthly grain allotments. Distribution happened at public horia granaries throughout the city. Citizens received small marked tokens or tablets entitling them to a ration. Distribution was managed by an intricate bureaucracy of clerks, registrars, inspectors, and logistics officers. It was free for most. Part of Rome's social contract: you live in the capital, the state will feed you. And someone had to keep the records. Licinius, the mid-level cog. Let's return to Licinius, not a senator, not a priest, not even an elected official. He is a scriba fermentarius, one of hundreds of mid-ranking administrators whose job was to maintain the grain recipient registry, track inventory from ships, granaries, and mills, log withdrawals and allocations, flag fraudulent claims, issue tokens, tesserae, and replace lost ones after verifying identity and eligibility. His tools: a worn wax tablet, a stylus, access to archived records going back decades, a deep suspicion of anyone who changed their story. His working hours were long, the pay was modest, but he had power: quiet, paper-thin power. A mistake could mean a family went hungry. A clerical delay could spark public unrest. A discrepancy in the ledgers could trigger a senatorial inquiry. And Licinius knew it. How the system worked. Here, what a day of distribution looked like for Licinius. Shipments arrive. Grain from Egypt or Sicily, measured in modii, is offloaded at the port of Ostia. Transport and storage. Carts bring the grain to horia public granaries under military or freedman supervision. Daily tally. Clerks like Licinius inspect the grain, compare it to manifests, and note discrepancies. Token verification. Citizens present their tesserae, small inscribed tokens made of wood, bronze, or lead. Licinius checks the registry to ensure they are male Roman citizens, enrolled in the urban census, not exceeding their monthly allotment. Disbursement. Approved citizens receive 5 modii of grain, roughly 40 liters, enough for a small family for a week. Simple on the surface, yes, but beneath it was a labyrinth of records, procedures, and fragile infrastructure. Common problems. The fermentatio rarely ran smoothly. Here are some common complications Licinius dealt with. Duplicate tokens, often caused by theft, forgery, or clerical error. Licinius had to cross-reference names and addresses, sometimes calling on local vicomagistry neighborhood officials to verify identity. Late shipments, bad weather, piracy, or corruption could delay grain from Africa. Licinius might be forced to ration reduced amounts or close the Horea entirely. Spoilage, grain improperly stored could mold or attract pests. Licinius had to file incident reports, often blaming warehouse managers, who blamed dockworkers, who blamed merchants. Bribery attempts. Occasionally, someone would slide a denarius across the table, asking for an extra ration or adjusted record. Licinius didn't take bribes. He'd seen what happened to those who did. The bureaucratic machinery. Licinius wasn't alone. The grain distribution system employed a complex hierarchy. Praefectus Annani, the top official responsible for the entire grain supply, appointed by the emperor. Procurators and curators oversaw regional storage and transportation. Scribi and tabularii handled records, disbursements, and audits. Vilici, granary managers, often freedmen or loyal slaves. Licinius reported to a local tabularius, a kind of auditor, but had daily contact with freedmen, warehouse staff, porters, and occasionally soldiers, if tensions rose. There were even inspectors, called speculators annani, who investigated shortages, theft, and administrative incompetence. Rome was a city held together not just by legions, but by ledgers. Hunger and the mob. The stakes were high. In a city so large, with so many poor citizens dependent on the fermentatio, any failure in distribution could ignite riots. In 23 BCE, food shortages nearly triggered mass revolt until Augustus himself intervened. In 19 CE, rumors of corrupted grain stores caused a stampede at a Horeum, killing dozens. In 70 CE, the Great Fire of Rome disrupted grain logistics, prompting emergency distributions and widespread panic. Clerks like Licinius bore the pressure. If he filed the wrong tally, failed to log a shortage, or dismissed a desperate citizen too quickly, it could spark violence. And when mobs gathered, the first thing they often burned was the record office. The work behind the bread. Grain distribution was more than giving out food. It was population control. Enrollment in the fermentatio was a tool for tracking citizens. Political propaganda. Emperors advertised their generosity through grain subsidies. Cultural identity. Being a Roman citizen meant having access to the grain dole, a tangible symbol of belonging. Licinius knew this. He wasn't just recording data, he was upholding the idea of Rome. His ledgers were read by auditors. His figures informed imperial reports. When the emperor boasted that no Roman went hungry, it was because Licinius wrote it down that way. A closing thought. In the grand narrative of empire, no one writes odes to the man with the stylus. There are no statues for the clerk behind the counter. But Rome's greatness was not built only on conquest. It was sustained by organization, by paperwork, by daily accountability. And in the long queue outside the Horeum, in the scratch of wax tablets, in the silent calculation of grain tallies, we see not glory but function. Without that function, Rome would have starved itself long before any barbarian crossed its gates. If you were to stand at the mouth of the Tiber during the late Republic or early Empire, you'd see it clearly. The bustling port of Ostia, Rome's supply artery. Cargo ships from Carthage, Alexandria, and Syracuse approached cautiously, sails furled. Dockworkers shouted in a dozen languages. Cranes creaked. Amphorae clinked. And behind it all was the cargo that mattered most, grain. Because Rome's population could riot for many reasons, but it only rebelled en masse when the bread stopped coming. And back in his small stone office, Licinius the clerk was already checking his shipment schedule and beginning to sweat. The port of Ostia and the grain lifeline. By the time of Licinius' service, Ostia had long been transformed into an imperial logistics hub. Granaries Horia lined the streets. A system of canals and warehouses connected docks to barges. Ships entered through an artificial harbor built by Claudius and later improved by Trajan. Grain was transferred to flat-bottomed barges, pulled upriver to Rome by tugboats and oxen on towpaths. It was a logistical marvel, but also a system terrifyingly sensitive to disruption. One storm could delay dozens of ships. A damaged quay could halt offloading for days. Labor disputes or missing dockworkers could stall an entire week's rations. And when delays happened, Licinius' office far from the docks was the first to feel the ripple. A clerk's nightmare, the delayed convoy. The year was 111 CE. Heavy autumn storms off Sicily had pushed back a major grain convoy, delaying over 80,000 modii of grain bound for Rome. Licinius received word via courier. Barges late from Ostia, prepare for rationing. Panic did not ensue yet, but within hours, queues outside the granary lengthened. Merchants whispered of wheat price jumps in the Subura. Citizens holding tokens became agitated, accusing officials of hoarding. Licinius had no control over the grain itself, but he had all the power over its paper trail. So he got to work. Damage control by wax tablet. In the following days, Licinius and his fellow clerks initiated a well-practiced sequence. Staggered token access. Citizens were divided into smaller groups based on their vicus neighborhood. Fewer people per day, less chaos. Half-ration notices. Licinius posted placards notifying that for the next 3 days, rations would be halved. Better some food than a riot. Expedited spoilage reports. Old grain from reserve stores was checked and rechecked. Licinius overruled 2 spoilage claims, risking slight mold exposure to stretch supply. Emergency supply ledger activation. He accessed a rarely used ledger of contingency reserves, often tapped only by imperial order. It was, by all accounts, a boring frenzy. No swords were drawn. No enemies breached gates. But the paper war to preserve civic order had begun. The logic of control. This moment underscores a key fact about Rome. Its survival wasn't due solely to its legions. It survived because men like Licinius knew how to delay panic through process. He knew how to balance public perception with hard numbers, quietly issue just enough rations to keep hunger from boiling into rage, satisfy auditors with clear documentation, even when improvising, make imperial weakness look like planned moderation. And all of it was done in low voices, with steady hands behind wooden desks. The bureaucracy behind the bread. As the delay wore on, Licinius' role brought him into contact with more elite officials. The procurator Anony visited the Horia personally, demanding copies of intake logs. A tribune of the cohorts, Urbani, sent a few guards to observe the crowds and indirect warning. Letters from the office of the prefectus Anony arrived, warning of scrutiny from above. Licinius had to double and triple check every inventory count, withdrawal record, citizen complaint, alternative supply line. Failure to explain even a 0.5% discrepancy might result in personal liability, fines, or dismissal. This was the flip side of the clerk's power. Intense personal risk without the insulation of political rank. The calm after the cargo. 3 days later, the convoy arrived. Wind blown and behind schedule, the ships unloaded just over 72,000 modii, some sacks waterlogged, others short-measured. Licinius had to adjust every tally, file separate reports for spoilage, and request funds for grain drying. He did all of it within 6 hours. Why? Because in another part of the city, whispers had started again. Whispers about unfair distribution, accusations of favoritism, threats of protest. But when the tokens resumed their full value the next morning, and sacks were given out, as promised, the whispers died. Licinius didn't smile. He just added a note to his records. Shortage weak, no civil disturbance, emergency ledger restored, recommend increased oversight during late sailing seasons. How the empire measured its own stability. Events like this happened often, but they were rarely recorded in the sweeping histories of Livy or Tacitus. They were not memorable, but they were diagnostic. If the ledgers were complete, and the people fed, and the guards bored, then Rome was stable. If discrepancies grew, and tokens were counterfeited, and rations missed, instability loomed. In this way, Licinius and clerks like him were Rome's internal barometers, watching the weather, not of storms, but of social cohesion. The invisible power. For all their supposed weakness, clerks like Licinius wielded a quiet authority. Not through charisma, not through edict, but through records. They knew who was cheating the ration. They knew which neighborhoods missed deliveries. They knew which freedman contractors could be trusted. In moments of calm, they were ignored. In moments of crisis, they were indispensable. But they never became famous. Their power left no statues, only storage receipts and ink-stained wax. A closing thought. There are empires remembered for their battles. There are cities remembered for their monuments. But somewhere, there's a forgotten building where someone once whispered, "Wait, what did Licinius write down?" And that note, scratched in wax or ink, might have kept a crowd from rioting, might have prevented a magistrate's disgrace, might have ensured a family's only meal that week. Rome was held together by generals, yes, but also by the man who counted the sacks. The wars came, the emperors changed, the borders shrank. But the grain clerks kept writing. Even as the foundations of Rome trembled, even as Germanic tribes crossed the Alps and emperors fled to Ravenna, the grain still arrived, and the ledgers were still kept, at least for a time. In this final section of Licinius's story, we examine the twilight years of Roman grain administration, the slow collapse of urban logistics, and the remarkable afterlife of records, long after the empire itself had cracked and faded. Because paper, ink, and memory are sometimes more durable than walls and armies. The long goodbye of the grain system. By the 4th century CE, Rome was no longer the center of imperial power. Emperors increasingly ruled from Mediolanum, Milan, then Ravenna, and finally Constantinople. The grain supply from Egypt was diverted to the new capital in the east. The population of Rome declined sharply, perhaps to 100,000 or fewer. And yet the grain system endured in skeletal form. Smaller ships still docked at Ostia. Fewer citizens lined up at the granaries. The fermentatio continued, but with fewer clerks, fewer rations, and greater uncertainty. Licinius, if he were alive in this period, would have recognized the symptoms. A larger number of temporarily suspended tokens. Granaries operating part-time or by neighborhood rotation. Citizens complaining that the same sack of grain was counted twice in the records. The empire hadn't fallen yet, but the ledgers were fraying and the paper held the proof. The rise of the church bureaucrat. As the old civic institutions weakened, another entity stepped in, the Christian church. And it did so not with swords but with records. Bishops began distributing food to the poor as part of their ministry. Diocesan officials maintained charity rolls, very similar to earlier grain registries. In some districts, church-run horia were indistinguishable from their state predecessors. By the time of Pope Gregory I, late 6th century, the Roman Church had entire administrative teams for food relief, including archivists, stewards, and scribes. The Church's clerks copied the habits of the grain scribes before them. Meticulous logs, daily tallies, formalized appeals and adjustments, audits. In some cases, the same storage buildings were used. Even the metal tokens resembled the old tesserae. In essence, the Church had inherited Licinius's desk. The clerks who remembered too much. Long after Rome's Western Empire had collapsed, Eastern administrators in Constantinople were still referencing old census records from the 3rd century, provincial grain quotas, harbor manifests, and military supply lists from Italy. Many of these documents came from copies stored in archives, often maintained in dusty rooms by men like Licinius. These bureaucrats, never famed or rewarded, had preserved a memory of Rome so granular that even emperors forgot it existed. When Justinian's agents sought to reorganize grain distributions in Italy in the 6th century, they reportedly consulted older Roman records, trying to re-establish the old numbers. Paper survived where policy had not. What became of Licinius? There is, of course, no record of Licinius's death. He appears in no epitaph, no statue bears his name. But we can imagine his final years somewhere between 120–130 CE. Still cross-referencing ration tallies. Still filing complaints about missing sacks. Still cautioning against allowing non-citizens onto the registry. Still wondering why every year the ledgers grew heavier and the tokens more fragile. Perhaps he retired quietly. Perhaps he trained an apprentice. Perhaps he, like so many Roman clerks, simply faded into the margins of his own documents. We may never know. But his work quiet, boring, essential outlived emperors. The rediscovery of the ledgers. In modern times, fragments of the Roman grain system have been uncovered. Inscriptions listing grain weights and warehouse inventories in Ostia. Clay tablets showing individual allotments to named citizens. Wooden writing tablets from Vindolanda, far in the north of Britain, referencing the grain sent from Rome 1,000 miles away. And in every one, we see the same rhythm. The structure, the caution, the diligence. They are the echo of Licinius's world, fossilized in ink and ash. The legacy of boring survival. Why does this matter? Because we often credit empires to their founders and generals. But empires endure or collapse on the shoulders of record keepers. Licinius was one of them. He didn't command armies. He didn't govern provinces. He didn't write laws or build aqueducts. But he made the empire legible, a web of names, rations, schedules, ports, and permissions. And that legibility, the act of writing things down, of checking twice, of filing the boring report, was a kind of power. The kind that doesn't win battles, but the kind that lets everything else function. A final reflection, the empire on wax. So the next time you imagine Rome, don't think only of its marble arches and legions on parade. Picture also the dusty room with open tablets, the clerk scratching out grain tallies by candlelight, the worn bench, the smudged ink, the precise fingers. Rome was not just a story of conquest. It was also a story of quiet continuity. And for centuries, that continuity was preserved by men like Licinius. Because even when the walls fell and the emperors scattered, the ledgers remained, and for a time, so did Rome.